Behind me are the graves of almost 11,000 German soldiers who never returned home from the Second World War. All of them were sons, some of them fathers, brothers, all devastated their families when they never returned. Many of the men who lie at rest here died during the fighting in the last winter of the war, during the Ardennes offensive. And today, we're here at Sandweiler German War Cemetery to hear some of the stories of some of the individuals who are buried here. The purpose of this video is not to glorify the regime that these men lying behind me fought and died for. It's to help us expand our historical understanding of the time period so we can better understand them and what brought them here on this quiet hillside here in Luxembourg. This next story we're going to, not only do we know about what he did during the war, we know a little bit about the man who he was before the war ripped him out of that life. Let's go to this man's cross, his grave marker, and see what we can learn about him.
If we only look at Heinrich Giessel's burial report, the record of his life is painfully brief, but the memories he left behind tell a much richer story. He was born on the 6th of March 1910 in Frankfurt-Frechenheim. Heinrich worked in an operating service of the Reichsbahn, which was Germany's railway service, at Hochstadt-Döringheim station. A surviving group photograph shows Heinrich among uniformed railway colleagues. At a first glance, their clothing might appear military. However, the winged wheel emblems on their caps identify them as employees of the Deutsches Reichsbahn, not soldiers. This photograph therefore offers us a glimpse of Heinrich's civilian working life before the war. It is not evidence that he had previously served in the army. Those who knew him remembered him as a cheerful, friendly man who was always ready to lend a hand. When elderly or unwell passengers needed assistance, Heinrich would carry their suitcases for them. He loved to laugh, he painted, and he loved to sing. One enduring memory places him inside a signal box, singing in the highest tones. In October of 1935, Heinrich married Margareta Eibelshäuser, and together they had a daughter. Tragically, she would never have the chance to know her father personally. What she later learned about him came from the memories of those who had known him before the war took him away. By the final months of the war, Heinrich was serving as a Gefreiter on the Western Front. According to his biography, he probably experienced combat for the first time on the 24th of February 1945. Around that time, he wrote a letter to Margarete. He told her that they were facing a 30-kilometer march before confronting the enemy. Surrounded by much younger soldiers, Heinrich wrote that he was the oldest among them. As he prepared for what lay ahead, his thoughts turned to his wife. He wrote that their life together was passing before his eyes. He remembered the peaceful years they had shared, years he described as being filled with happiness and contentment. And he told Margarete that he would do anything just to be able to see her again. In that letter, there is no talk about military glory. It is simply a voice of a husband longing for the life that he might never return to. After that letter, the historical record goes painfully quiet. An American burial report lists Bitburg, Germany as Heinrich's place of death, although the exact date was never recorded. The cause of death was entered simply as a shell fragment wound to the forehead, or SFW forehead. No identification tag was found with him. Instead, Heinrich was identified through his Sollbuch, the military record book he had been carrying. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the 10th of March 1945, the American Graves Registration Service buried Heinrich in the provisional German cemetery at Sandweiler. On their form, the location was recorded as Ham, Luxembourg. Today, Heinrich rests in Block Q, Row 12, Grave 282. However, anyone looking closely at Heinrich's headstone will notice that it gives a date of death as the 10th of May, 1940. This date does not correspond with the surviving sources. Heinrich's biography quotes a letter he wrote to his wife in February of 1945, while the American burial report records his burial the following month, but it leaves his date of death unknown. It therefore appears that an error may have been made when the date on his headstone was recorded. Based on the surviving evidence, Heinrich's actual date of death remains unknown. This discrepancy also is a reminder of why continued historical research is so important. Information can be recorded incorrectly and then carried forward for decades. It is only by comparing biographies, letters, and original documents that these inconsistencies can be discovered and individual stories preserved as accurately as possible. But that work does not happen on its own. The Volksbund maintains cemeteries such as Sandweiler and works to preserve the memory of those buried here. Through this channel, I try to build upon that work by researching and sharing the individual stories behind the names. If you believe this work is important, please consider supporting both the Volksbund and this YouTube channel, because remembering Heinrich is not about honoring the regime under which he served or the war in which he fought. It is about recognizing what the war took from one individual family: a railway worker who carried luggage for those in need, a husband who wanted nothing more than to see his wife again, and a father whose daughter was left to discover who he had been only through the memories of others.
Today, Heinrich Giessel is just one of the 10,913 human lives that lie at rest here in this Luxembourg cemetery. But he was a father, he was a husband, a railway worker, a man who knew exactly what he was leaving behind when he went off to war. He became a casualty of this war, forever breaking the hearts of his wife and his child. These are the human connections to these kind of stories. If we were born into the wrong system in the wrong time, it could unfortunately be our names on these crosses instead of these individuals here. And you almost have to be thankful that men like these, or the ones at the American cemetery just down the road, endured such hardships. It's because of the hardships that they endured that we get to live in peace today.
Before we return to the individual stories, it is important to understand how the cemetery came to exist. During the heavy fighting of the winter of 1944 and the spring of 1945, the American Graves Registration Service recovered both German and American dead from the surrounding broader region. 2 provisional burial grounds were established. American soldiers were buried near Hamm, while the German dead were brought here to Sandweiler. The 2 cemeteries lie only 1.5 kilometers apart. By the time the American burial teams completed their work, 5,599 German war dead had been buried here. At that time, their graves were marked by small wooden crosses. In 1952, Luxembourg and the Federal Republic of Germany signed an agreement concerning German war graves. It was the first agreement of its kind between post-war Germany and one of its neighboring countries. This allowed the Volksbund to begin turning Sandweiler into a permanent war cemetery. Another 5,286 German war dead were brought here from 150 different burial sites from across Luxembourg. Many had been buried in mass graves for which only incomplete records survived. The reburial work also created an opportunity to identify some of those names who had been previously unknown. On June 5, 1955, Sandweiler was officially opened to the public. It became the first war cemetery established abroad by the Volksbund after the Second World War. More than 2,000 relatives attended the inauguration, with around 1,500 arriving aboard 2 special trains. Among them was Ida Margengele, who had traveled to visit the grave of her brother Josef. She remembered people arriving with flowers and wreaths, and later recalled that the cemetery was black with people. Many remained besides the graves of their relatives throughout the cemetery, lost in their own memories and grief. Today, a total of 10,913 war dead rest here. Of those, 4,829 lie within the communal grave, where the names of more than 4,000 identified individuals are recorded. But behind these numbers are thousands of separate lives, each with a family, a home, and a story of their own. One of those stories belongs to Rudolf Krank, a husband, a father whose family was left waiting for answers until 1955. Let's hear his story.
Imagine dying in this brutal war and then laying under an unknown grave. No marker for your family to come and mourn your death. And then later, through work done through organizations, a name was able to be put to the body, and now you have a marker. That's the story about this next person. We're going to go to his marker and hear and learn what we can about him.
Rudolf was born in April of 1908. He was the son of August and Theresa Krank. The surviving records disagree over his exact date of birth and whether he was born in Saarbrücken or Mannheim. After attending school, Rudolf trained to work in the insurance profession. Then, in 1935, Rudolf married Theresa Schmidt, who came from Saarbrücken. Together they had a daughter. For the first few years of the war, Rudolf remained with his family, but in 1941, at the age of 33, he was drafted into the Wehrmacht and sent to Mainz for basic training. A surviving photograph shows Rudolf in uniform, standing beside his parents. It's one of the few personal images that we have that remain from this period of his life. He was then stationed mainly in the region of Alsace-Lorraine in modern-day France. In 1944, Rudolf was trained as a radio operator and sent to the city of Metz. From this point, the surviving records begin to tell us two different stories. A troop report dated the 15th of December 1944 stated that Rudolf had fallen in wooded terrain near Büdingen. But Rudolf was actually recovered from the forest near Eltenbruck in Luxembourg. When he was found, he was initially recorded as an unknown soldier. His identity was later established through the identification disc that he had been carrying. At the time of his death, Rudolf was serving with the 5th Company of the Grenadier Regiment 1216. On the 3rd of January 1945, at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Rudolf was reburied in the Provisional German Cemetery here at Sandweiler. But his wife and daughter still did not know where he had been laid to rest. The surviving files show that the search for answers continued after the war, and it was not until 1955, more than 10 years after Rudolf's burial, that information connected to an overseas report was finally communicated to his wife. That same year, Theresa and their daughter traveled to Sandweiler and visited Rudolf's grave. Nearly 4 decades later, in 1993, they returned once more. Today, Rudolf rests here in Block C, Row 7, Grave 159. The documents cannot tell us what he experienced during his final days, but they do reveal what the war left behind. A wife and a daughter searching through conflicting records, a man buried far from home initially without his name, and a family forced to wait 10 years before they finally knew where Rudolf had been laid to rest.
For anyone else walking by this row of crosses here, Rudolf Krank's grave was just another marker. But for his family, that was a grave of a husband, of a father who had finally been found and now had a place where they could go to and mourn his loss. I've been to the cemetery before to film a video about different stories about individuals who fought during that Ardennes offensive. I went to their graves and talked about their stories here in Sandweiler, and then I went to the battlefields near Bastogne where they fell and died. But today, I'm back here to talk about 3 different individual stories. When I initially came to Sandweiler to film my first video, at the time, this was the largest German war cemetery that I had been to. Since then, I've been to several different German war cemeteries and made videos about them with much higher casualty numbers. Though coming back here, that original impression I had of this place still remains. It's a very somber and sorrow place. The stone markers are among the crosses. The entranceway to the cemetery is through a path on the forest and through a tight door. And as you walk through the path, you see the giant garnet cross from the comrade's grave there to greet you. And the tight door is actually an interesting part about German war cemeteries. The architect who designed this one had the theory that if you want to go into the land of the dead, you go one by one through a door. And then when you walk through the path, you're greeted by this massive image of crosses facing you to help you really visualize the immense suffering and brutal fighting that occurred in this conflict. I want you to imagine that you're fighting in one of the most brutal wars humanity has ever seen, and you write your mother a letter letting her know that you're all right. And then 1 month later, you go officially missing. That's what happened to Werner Georg. Let's walk to his gravestone and let's hear and try to learn from his story.
Werner was born on the 11th of June 1925 in Ludwigshafen am Rhein. His father, Friedrich, worked as a merchant and his mother was named Lena. After completing primary school in 1940, Werner began an apprenticeship as an electrician. In 1943, he passed his journeyman's examination. At just 18 years old, he had qualified for the civilian trade in which he had trained. But instead of beginning the life in which he had trained for, Werner entered the compulsory Reichslabor service. He had been there for only 3 months when on the 28th of July 1943 he was drafted into the Wehrmacht. He was initially sent to Poland, where his postings included Lublin and Zamość. In January of 1943 he completed his military training as a sniper. In April of that year, Werner was seriously wounded and he spent the following months in a military hospital and was eventually allowed to return home on convalescent leave. But his time with his family was only temporary. From October 10th, 1944, Werner was once again serving as a sniper, this time in the Ardennes, around Hives. The letter Werner left behind offers one of the few direct glimpses into what he was thinking during these final weeks. In that letter, he told his mother that he had arrived in the West and asked how she was doing. He also wanted to know whether they had suffered another attack at home, before reassuring her that everything was still fine where he was. Werner knew that Christmas would not be as pleasant as it had been the year before. He wrote about hoping that better times would eventually return. However, the language of his letter also reflected the propaganda surrounding him. Despite Germany's increasingly hopeless military position, Werner believed that the final decisive battle had begun. He wrote that now he had to endure everything without complaint. He eventually brought the letter to an end because he still wanted to write others. His final words to his mother were simple: "Many kisses and greetings from your son, Werner." At the beginning of February 1945, the company's Hauptfeldwebel, which is the equivalent of the American Company First Sergeant, informed Werner's family that he had been listed missing since January 18th. He believed Werner might have been taken prisoner. For his family, that possibility left some reason of hope, something they could hold on to, but they received no definite answer until 1947. That year, 1947, the International Committee of the Red Cross informed his family that Werner had been buried on the 14th of February 1945 at the German military cemetery in Ham, Luxembourg. The surviving American report of burial records Hives, Belgium as the place where Werner fell. His exact date of death was listed as unknown, while the cause was recorded as SFW, a shell fragment wound to the back. The same report contains an imprint of his identification disc and records that Werner was buried with it at 10 o'clock on the morning of February 14th. The possibility that he might return from captivity ended with the location of his grave. Today, Werner rests at Sandweiler in Block I, grave 183. He was only 19 years old. Werner's story gives us a glimpse into the life of a young man who had his whole future ahead of him, but was drafted into a conflict that cut that future short. His final letter also reveals how the propaganda of his time shaped the way that he understood the war. Even as Germany's military position had become increasingly hopeless, Werner believed that the final decisive battle had begun, and that it might still turn the tide. But instead of returning home and building the life he had prepared for through his apprenticeship, his grave now lies on this quiet hillside in Luxembourg.
Werner Georg's story survived because his letter survived. That way, we were able to learn a little about who he was from that letter. And those were the stories that I wanted to return to Sandweiler German War Cemetery for, to tell the stories of Werner, who wrote a letter to his mother, only to go missing a month later. Or Rudolf Krank, his family not knowing where his remains were, and then his body being identified, finally having a place to mourn the loss of their loved one. Or Heinrich, remembered before the war, who had built a life for himself, who went into this war and became a casualty of it. I tell these stories. The purpose for this is to remind us that these numbers, they can look like a statistic, but these were human lives. Individuals who had hopes and dreams that were ended abruptly due to the brutal war that a regime unleashed on Europe. I just want to show you guys one interesting row of crosses that I came across here. If we take a look here at these 12 individuals, they all died on the 9th of September, 1944. People like Max, Richard, an unknown soldier, Walter, Franz, Werner, Georg, Paul, Herbert, Walter, all lost their lives on the same day. I don't want to make any assumptions of why they all died in the same day and buried together, but there's many possibilities. However, it's quite tragic when you come here and you just see an immense amount of life lost, especially in a single day, maybe even a single moment. And that brings us to an end of today's video of my second visit here at Sandweiler German War Cemetery in Luxembourg. If you liked this video and thought that it added some educational value, subscribe to the channel so we can continue learning together. Also, please take a moment out of your day to look at the German War Graves Commission, the Volksbund, because they are responsible for maintaining cemeteries like this. And if without the work that they do, coming to visit a place like this may not be possible as we know it. Not only do they maintain these cemeteries, they also provide educational learning opportunities to educate the next generations about the horrific loss of war and what the brutality of that was. They also do many more things, so take a moment out of your day to check them out. The work that they do is important. Any War Graves Commission, the French, the Americans, the British, the Germans, the work that they do is immensely important to remind the future generations what peace really means.
Throughout this video, we have looked beyond the numbers and into the lives of 3 men buried here. Men who once had families, professions, plans, and futures of their own. But acknowledging their humanity does not erase the wider history. The regime then ruling Germany launched this war and occupied Luxembourg, Belgium, France, and much of Europe. Those occupations brought prosecution, forced labor, immense suffering, and crimes that must never be forgotten. Members of the German armed forces participated in these actions, although the responsibility of each individual buried here was not the same and in many cases may never fully be known. Telling these stories is not about absolution, it is about understanding how dictatorship, propaganda, and war can shape ordinary lives, destroy futures, and cause suffering far beyond the battlefield. The men buried here were human. The humanity does not erase responsibility. Both truths belong to this history and both must be remembered. Thank you for your time and thank you for watching this video.